So hi everybody. Nice to see many returning faces and some new ones as well. Um, yeah, I'm glad to see you back. I'm assuming that means the first session wasn't too terrible. And I think today's session is going to be pretty dense because basically trying to in this session will be kind of doing a big overview of certain key terms that I think are going to be helpful for us to elaborate or to at least help me explain how I'm kind of coming to these positions that have been some sort of major influential concepts that aren't necessarily explicitly mapped out in the text that we're reading. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But I also wanted to take this occasion to basically give a pretty well, I mean, you could do a whole, PhD on Sylvia Wynter, but I wanted to also take the kind of appropriate amount of time to go through and describe her model or her system that she was obviously like working on for decades. So because I think that that model of or her model or her system of thinking, her philosophical and sort of historical account has been just utterly like I can't express how important this work has been upon my own thinking. So I thought it would be a good exercise to kind of go through things. And if you had a chance to look at the reading that I had proposed from her, you'll probably understand why it's a good idea to take the time to um, go through it. Again, it'll be very general, but nonetheless, you maybe notice that she's quite a difficult writer. The sentences are very long. There's a lot of weird words in there. So hopefully in this synoptic version, we can at least get this general picture of what her model is doing. And then I found that once I was able to make that general picture, I was able to like better understand the text because there's just, she's in her 90s now and there's a ton of other material. And each essay basically has to rehearse her kind of model, but you're always getting different aspects of it sort of highlighted, if you want to ever do a deep dive on her work. Um, but I think just before we start, and before just sort of seeing if anyone has any questions or comments that stuck with you from last week that you want to like talk about today, I think we have a couple of new people. I'm just looking at here. Sean, I don't believe was with us last time, and we just it would just be lovely if you're able to and don't feel on the spot to just say hello and tell us what your background is, what you're studying, like what brings you here. Because we did that last week, so unfortunately the others will be a mystery to you. We won't do it again, but it's nice for everyone else to know what you're working on.
Hi, sounds good. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so first of all, tell me if this is my first Zoom meeting that I have actually turned on the microphone. Wasn't sure how that works. Anyway, so my name is Sean Ferguson. I live in Geneva, Switzerland. I've been here for 12 years. I work for the United Nations, and I'm an economist, a macroeconomist trained at the New School where I got my PhD um, about 15 years ago, a little more. And um, I've been working on a research that has to do with a certain obscure remark that took place at Bretton Woods, the Savannah, Georgia conference in 1946 by John Maynard Keynes. And it's kind of awkward to join these groups from a certain perspective because I'm having to pull my dog. Well, that's not why, because I'm not really familiar with your reading lists, and I'm doing an intense amount of work to try to just brush up on the basics. I had read something by Sylvia Wynter many years ago. I found in my files, and for the most part, I'm fascinated to learn more about the 1492 threshold that you've mentioned, and I did watch the video last week's session. I'm sorry I couldn't join. I was with my father, and there are certain things that I find fascinating, and I'm hoping to share a little bit more of the problems I'm working on if the interventions become possible, because I have a problem I'm trying to identify with how someone can identify a threshold that is built on previous technologies. For me, the first thing that came up to my mind when I started thinking about Sylvia Wynter's in your work was any relationship with Calvin and her work that she might have touched upon. I'm not sure. For me, Calvin is kind of almost one of these question marks, if it's a threshold situation, drawing on former kind of, I use the word technology. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but and
we're definitely going to be talking about certain the kind of let's say not gap in thought, but the space that Wynter opens up for speaking about operational, like making things operational. So that will hopefully get to it. And I'm very grateful that that we have an economist here, that you're here and open-minded, and despite it not being your discipline, I'm grateful, and I hope that there's going to be points that are relevant to your line of thought. So thanks for sharing, Sean.
great, glad to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think Nikos is as well new to this week. Yeah.
Yes, hello everybody. Nice to be here. I couldn't join last time, but I also watched the video. I am a graduate of economics, actually. I just finished my master's in political economy and international economics. And now I'm looking actually for some funding for a PhD that I'm planning to start in Berlin, in the Hochschule für Wirtschaftsrecht, the Berlin School of Economics and Law. With professor there, and my topic is going to be about logistics, actually, and I'm interested in the logistics revolution and how it shaped capitalism after the 70s. It's a very trendy, let's say, topic in the ultra left and autonomous Marxist circles, and there have been a lot of texts the last 10 years. So I am interested in the supply chain crisis that we face now, and I will try to approach this question from the perspective of logistic infrastructures. And I just joined this, let's say, course because I just find that I might get some inspiration from this, because it brings also this question of the local and the planetary somehow in my research agenda, let's say. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nikos. I'm glad to have you here. So now we've got two economy specialists added to our general intellect in the room, if you want to put it that way. Which
not
is
so
great.
specialist.
Okay. Well, more knowledge than I will be able to share with you. Is there anyone else that wasn't here last week that I missed?
I think I am.
Okay, so I wasn't sure. Yeah, nice to have you. Yeah, hi.
Hi. So I was on a work trip last session, but I also saw the lecture, so I kind of, the others will not be a mystery to me that much. So I'm a philosopher. I'm from Latvia. I'm doing a postdoctoral project on ontogenealogies of the body and environmental ethics in Latvia. So I'm very interested in like situated knowledges and how they can help, and also looking beyond the dialectic of local and global. I'm kind of moving into environmental humanities with this project before I did my PhD on the philosophy of body and kind of combining lived body phenomenology with like social constructivist Michel Foucault and Nietzschean views. Mm-hmm. So I think that's my background. Also a fan of Deleuze.
Okay. Did you read some Sally Haslanger perhaps on your social construction stuff?
No, actually, no, I did not. It
She's
was,
definitely
yeah, it was historicity of the body and kind of how we can build like an and fleshed, but in a sense, not that not essentialist view.
Mhm.
Kind of moving towards new materialism in the end, but
Mhm.
at that time, it wasn't that popular yet, at least not here.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I'm glad to have you. Thank you for jumping in and also for taking the time to watch the class from last week. That's great. Um, and yeah, like, does anyone have any things, urgent things that they feel they need to get off their chest, so to speak, or anything of that nature before we start going through the material today, which is not like I mean, we can for sure address certain readings. I'm basically including the readings, not so that we're going to like sit there and read line by line. I hope that's okay for you. They are referenced in the material, but I'm basically trying to, um, just show also the thinking supports that I've been working through as well, just to kind of put it all out there on the table so that it's clear where these ideas are being patchworked from, so to speak. Yeah. So we're good to go. Okay. So, like I said, so I'm just going to share my screen. Basically, this week, so let me just make that full screen. Good. So I think you should see the full screen and not my because I have a double monitor, right? So you see the full slides. That's all good. Yeah. If someone just want to give me a thumbs up, that would be great. Okay. Perfect. Um, Yeah, so basically, last week, just to kind of rekindle the ideas, we were kind of looking at how we looked at some of the excerpts from Donna Haraway's Situated Knowledge, and with the mind of basically problematizing or giving a question to what the site of situatedness is and how it may be different in a high dimensional space. What we are calling a high dimensional space is basically a kind of synonym for complexity, if you want, which is a kind of structural condition of how I understand planetary space. We were also talking about navigation as a kind of synthesis between, the synthesis between map territory, thinking and doing, etc. And also thinking about navigation outside of just like what is given to us, right? But like navigation implies that you maybe have to start creating sites or these concept spaces. So that's quite important. And then I guess more directly from Haraway, we were kind of like stuck on that interesting phrase that she had, right, about what we learn, being accountable. We learn how to see, but also being accountable for what we learn where to see, right? So I'm really kind of privileging that question of where. Um, and I think that's, I mean, and then yeah, they're kind of introducing this concept of like, or this idea of moving away from accepting this ready-made space of the kind of Euclidean framework to the question of how does one make ready our points of orientation for this new type of, or this new high dimensional coexistence, basically. So this is I think I'm really excited about this problem because it is also, I think, it's a problem that I think touches a lot of disciplines, and a place where I feel that my own field, the visual arts, can maybe start to have some more productive traction beyond just making exhibitions, if you want. So yeah, and this was of course the diagram that was that corresponded with the article that I had submitted, and it was basically the starting point. The reason why I'm basically supplying you with articles that I've written in a sort of sequence because this was the one that really catalyzed a really concrete, or let's say more in depth thinking about this spatial problem that was sort of launched in my head by asking the simple question like, how do you define what are the borders of location within a planetary dimension space, right? How do we understand something as local? How do we define the border of what is not local, etc., right? And in our everyday speech, we usually have a kind of common agreement about what that means. If I tell you, oh, the shop is local, you'll kind of have an idea. Maybe it means it's walkable, etc. But obviously, that's a pretty, I would say, unhelpful heuristic when we're speaking about different scales of existence. So that was a sort of, I'd say, main theme of the last week. And then this week, what I wanted to do to just begin, like I said, I wanted to spend a little bit of time going over some key terms. Again, for some of you, I apologize if these are a bit like, philosophy 101, because some of these terms are very well known. But I just feel like, considering we're in a really interdisciplinary space with a lot of different backgrounds, it can't hurt to just go over them relatively quickly so that there's no confusion when we read them in the text or when I'm using them in a lecture format, that we have a kind of common understanding of what we mean. And certainly we can start like this sort of, the first couple of terms I would say are related to the question of like, what binds us to the givenness of the here and now, right? Like, why is it so hard to think outside of the constraints of the here and now? And one answer to such question, at least according to Foucault, would be this episteme. And I never know if someone knows the actual proper way of saying this. I've heard it said so many different ways. So I don't feel like there's a consensus on this. So please correct me if you know the exact way to say it. But yeah, so basically, what's that?
Oh, it's episteme.
Episteme. Okay, great.
Episteme, yeah.
Episteme. Okay. We've got a Greek speaker that's hopefully instructing. So, okay, so the episteme is basically, as as the quote says, it's these kind of fundamental codes of the culture that establish for every man, for the very first, the empirical orders with which he will be dealing and within which he'll be at home. So I was using this in the context of thinking about it as this kind of, it's obviously a ground of positive self-reference upon which our knowledge orders are positively rooted. And by positive, I don't mean that as a moral definition. I just mean that is how they kind of root their position of self-reference. It's broadly what allows us to identify brackets of history, right? There's a kind of modern episteme. There's see, now I'm not going to be able to say it. The modern episteme, a medieval episteme, etc. Right? And it's I guess a way that we could, if we're doing this kind of like historical archaeology, we could identify these sort of broad epochs, even though there's hundreds of years. They compose of hundreds of years, and changes do occur within them. But basically, we can think of the episteme as the kind of a kind of boundary making operation upon what is thinkable, what is adjudicated as proper ways of knowing, what is a relevant question, etc. And I think it's also important to note within the context that we're dealing with, right? Like, not only is it a way of domesticating thought, which I think has some interesting resonance within feminist work as well on themes of domesticity, but we're not going to touch on that today. But the term itself is basically related to the question, like the etymological roots of it are related to a kind of combination of knowing and placing, right? So this kind of concept of placing things is also sort of internal, baked into that concept of the episteme. And the next one that I would want to bring up is, and again, I bring up episteme because this is a fundamental concept for Winter, as well as sociogeny, which she borrows from Frantz Fanon. And particularly this concept was introduced in Black Skin, White Masks. And basically it is kind of a it is this kind of way this social kind of encoding gets reproduced and rehearsed. So Fanon famously said, besides phylogeny and ontogeny, stands sociogeny, right? So what he's basically saying is that he's kind of giving parity, if you want, to the social domain, the artificial domain of human existence, on par with that of like biological concerns of the human, right? Saying, so for Winter, this is fundamental because she's kind of going against the tendency of Western European thought that she's criticizing, that thinks they can capture the human through biophilic or phylogenetic categories alone. And she says, no, no, no. This third level of existence is precisely what this kind of, which has definitely got more of an existential bent, is a kind of. She even goes so far as to say we need to complete the Fanonian epistemic revolution. So basically, sociogeny is a term that Fanon coined to describe these feedback processes between structures and the internalization of the structures, both on the part of, and he's looking, of course, at the racialized, colonialized circumstances where, feelings of superiority are internalized on the part of the oppressor, and feelings of self-adjudication of inferiority is adopted by those colonized subjects. And kind of in a kind of critical move in a kind of critique of psychiatry, because of course he's a psychiatrist, he's looking at the case of, say, like something like racism, right? Where it would be absolutely ridiculous to tell a patient of yours, someone that comes to you suffering psychological distress, to cure them by better adapting them to their environment, which is pathologically against them, right? So the only cure in that way is what Fanon called sociodiagnostic, which is basically like, the cure is political agitation, right? So basically, for Fanon, this kind of psycho-existential complex of anti-Black racism, it manifests in this double process. Like I said, in this, he's borrowing from W. Du Bois' double consciousness. So that objectively structured suppression of economic possibility, reinforced by this subjective internalization. So this is what makes, when we hear later in Winter's work about a sociogenic replicator code, it's this feedback dynamic that is making this sort of an operational principle, and completely stratifying human societies. So but the question, because we're looking at this, or at least I'm trying to look at Winter and her set of influences from this, let's say, operationalizing standpoint, how are forms of social, come to the question of, how are forms of social encoding operationalized beyond this pure concept, right? So I think that we need to be adding, besides phylogeny, ontogeny, and sociogeny, there also stands technogeny, right? So we're going to be adding a kind of rejoinder to this. And again, to clarify, what do we mean by techne here, right? Which is not just technology for those. It also has a correlation to art. It's quite a bit more general than just technology. But I'm going to borrow Keith Tilford's helpful distinction, because he's also opening up a space for us to later bring this into the computational realm. But so Tilford writes that techne is meant to designate not only the classic reversibility or relay with episteme that it often carries in philosophy, right? So it's, in this basic sense, it's exactly that operator, if you want, between the ideas and doing, but in a broader envelope relating social and linguistic practices to the interlacing of a diversity of knowledges, techniques, logics, institutions, and technologies that developments in computational research are fundamentally transforming. So that's this sort of rejoinder to this sociogenic principle, right? In winter, she transforms sociogeny to sociogenic principle. Okay, and then I think these next this next term I think is important because it is addressing the stakes of the project that I think when we're talking about a planetary turn, if you remember from last week, we're talking about it in terms of like how it could index a different historical epoch, a different historical episteme. So what are the stakes of what we're doing? And in winter, she uses this term cosmogony is very central for her, right? This kind of origin story. I prefer to use cosmology just because I think it opens up other other categories of intervention beyond these pure sort of like origin stories. And the definition that I found the most helpful personally is from Bentley Allen. He's a international relations scholar, because I find that term cosmology, when you don't qualify it, it's incredible where people take it. It can take on a very esoteric dimension. I just like to be very clear about what I appreciate about the term. So what are the stakes, right? So basically for Bentley Allen, cosmology is composed of ontology, epistemology, temporality, cosmogony, and destiny. So to me, this is like offering us, when we're thinking about mapping winter very directly into these kind of concerns related to the planetary, cosmogony is certainly an incredibly important element of this. But I find that cosmology better integrates the epistemic dimension that she is insisting on, but not to mention temporality, right? Because I think that's also one huge problem of how do we develop, you know, models of the planetary where all these sort of like various temporal scales all of a sudden get laminated. How do we understand that? How do we relate to things like deep time or geotime, if you want? So I want to leave the category a little bit more broad and think about it in terms of the cosmological stakes of the project. And for those interested, this book is quite interesting. It's very Western European scientific oriented, but basically what Bentley Allen does is map out taking some paradigmatic historical discoveries and then seeing how they get ramified in terms of re-understanding international world orders. It's a very interesting book. What is a bit terrifying about it is the hundreds of years gap between the scientific discovery, usually the persecution of the people who believe in the scientific discovery, until it's like very widely accepted and changes the view of how we imagine relating on an international scale. So the concrete example there would be, you know, like going from I'm trying to remember exactly, but like a Copernican turn ushered in a sort of mechanical view of the, you know, like a sort of balance of power, general sense of orientation for international relations. So things of that nature, right? So what was the cascading set of consequences after a significant, if you want to call it, paradigm shift in based on scientific knowledge came about? Obviously, with the reason I find that a bit terrifying is that it doesn't look like we have several hundred years to ramify a lot of the knowledge that we now have. So that's concerning, if I'm going to be diplomatic. Right, and then the other concept that I wanted to introduce was this is a kind of like not hidden thing, but it definitely appeared in a lot of earlier works, and I just think is kind of with me. So I thought, why not just be transparent and share it with you? Is this concept of inexistence that I'm taking from Alain Badiou, where it's, I know that I think it's Lyotard also talks about this. I'm definitely using the Badiousian sense, and it's basically to indicate a sense of like imminence, if you want. So we're not, when we're talking about like a paradigm shift, we're not necessarily like speaking about this kind of like and to be clear, I'm not like advocating the whole Badiousian event theory. So I'm just, you know, I endorse this concept. I'm not on board with a lot of the event based um, theorizing, but it's basically like uh, how you know, something will have a minimal degree of existence within a system, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? It doesn't have to be this brand new novel thing suddenly appear and shake things up. It's when the thing that exists with relation to a structure uh, of recognition has a, you know, degree zero, a minimum degree of recognition within that, you know, within which a system sees or cognizes something, um, that it's about bringing that recognition into kind of a maximal degree. And I think I can explain that a little bit more clear if we look at the quote here um, on the second page. But here he's talking about a very concrete example of, say, of suffrage, the story of suffrage in Quebec, like you say here, between 1918 and 1950. So from 1918, women who, of course, ontologically exist in the Quebecois culture, um, you know, before 1918, they inexist with the regard with the right to vote, with the civic right to vote. Likewise, for the indigenous population, this didn't come till much later. So the indigenous populations, it existed with regard to the civic right to vote, even though they ontologically, of course, exist. So I'm very interested in this movement between, you know, ontological existence and logical non-existence, if you want. And that's what the concept of the inexistent measures. So to bring something into this space of a maximal degree of existence, it's about inventing. It's you know, according to Badiou, it's this kind of inserting into the regime of visibility. It's and that's the act of politics, right? So the act of politics is this kind of um, making the part with no part, if you want to put it in Roncière's term, like come into some space of visibility. Which, of course, you know, for those those thinkers who are more attuned to some of the dangers of visibility, right? I think this particular generation, uh, you know, puts so much weight on the question of visibility and, you know, qua politics. And of course, today, that assertion even gets uh, difficult to make at such a universal scale, because there's modes of being visible, right, being seen by surveillance systems, etc., that can be punitive. So I mean, we're not going to go into all of that today, but I think that it's an interesting thing to see an update, a generational update that probably needs to happen because of the certain techno-political situations that we live in. But I think the main problem that I feel very connected to with Badiou, that he takes from Kierkegaard, is basically like how to inhabit the consequences of a concept or an idea, right? And that is, again, you know, recalling last week we were talking about the importance of the relation between, you know, models of the planetary and questions of inhabitation otherwise, which, so we have this kind of movement between the realm of ideality and the realm of sets of practices. So yeah, as a kind of ramification of the idea. And then yeah, just kind of, again, to recap this movement from sort of ready-made space to this question of how to make ready for these new conditions to come, if you want, and what types of transformations this may entail if we if we understand ourselves in resituated ways. What are the cascading sets of consequences upon our modes of sensing, upon just, you know, phenomenology in general? And I always was inspired by this one line from this poem from Wallace Stevens, called "The future is description without place." Right. So again, we're kind of keep stumbling into this kind of question of placing, how to place things, right? The episteme had this, this notion from Wallace Stevens, description without place. So, you know, and then we'll use the example of, say, reproductive navigation would be like looking in an encyclopedia, right? And of course, an encyclopedia can be, you can keep adding new entries, we can keep adding new stuff, but the navigation space of that mode of knowledge acquisition remains static. It's in alphabetical order. We're not coming to we're not defining new concept spaces through which to come into contact with knowledge, through which to relate different things, right? Like in an encyclopedia, it could, content-wise, it could just be arbitrarily two completely unrelated items simply because they start with the same letters, right? It's not like a robust conceptual way to organize knowledge. Whereas in productive navigation, we are charted with the problem of constructing concept spaces. And navigation is basically a kind of program that allows us to run through them. So maybe I'll just quote here the second part of this quote, because I think it's helpful to kind of understand. So a digital record is worthless without being organized as a concept form, as encoded knowledge, right? Keeping in mind, sociogeny is also a form of encoding. So understanding, i.e. decoding information, is needed in order to control and manage its knowledge potential. The digital age is not centered around bits and bytes, but around their accessibility and handling in data navigation. From the above, we learn that a powerful concept system for any field of knowledge must provide us with a thorough navigation method that works on an extensive concept space. And from the preceding discussion regarding depth and complexity, we deduce that navigation must have access to any encapsulated concept and permission to navigate on any possible concept path. So I think this is, again, when the reason why I was sort of pointing to this issue of, from ready-made to making ready is the question of accessibility, right? Like, how are we going to make these new concept spaces that are maybe premised on a new spatial understanding? How can we make them accessible, intelligible, and therefore shareable, and not just an internal mental project or something like that. So yeah, I think I would just maybe highlight some of the guiding questions that before we get into the winter stuff, like maybe highlight some of these questions so that maybe we can keep in the back of our minds as we go through winter. And again, if there's anyone that has any commentary or additional thoughts on some of those key terms that were sort of mapped out, or any questions, please, feel free to jump in. Yeah.
I just have a little, it's from last week as well.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned this towards the end of the lecture in your new paper with A. Caveat. Mm-hmm. But just basically just to put it out there that because this is so much about construction and this idea of like the dimensionality is important in how you construct the very way by which you set up the dimensions. So that's the whole like n-1, but Deleuze uses from mathematics and Riemann, Bernard Riemann. So it's not so much that there's a space, there's a way that in which you decide by which you construct the space itself, and then things happens. And one of the problems, at least in the history of mathematics, which is what Riemann did, basically, he pointed out that for many, many centuries, we kind of assumed that we know the structure of space. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that in mathematics, that's not the case. And that's what the problem was with Euclidean geometry, that it presupposed that there was already straight lines on which points travel on. And that's where when Deleuze and Guattari at least say about and everything is constructed from lines, is this idea that you start first from an N position and then you subtract from it a line to start focusing further in. I just wanted to say this because I know you changed then the definition of the N versus, it changes later on, but I think it's important this, construction of space. What does that mean in terms of its dimension or its metric, if you want to say, or units by which you use to construct the space itself, and what those presuppose, which is it's been the problem in mathematics at least.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for highlighting that, because that was exactly the quote from Anil. Well, I'll just say his normal name, though it's his author's name, but from Anil last week was indeed the kind of Riemann's big contribution was, of course, the non-givenness of space itself. But definitely, and please do chime in because I think you have a lot of knowledge about these dimensional things that is likely far surpassing my own. So I really do appreciate like corrections or making things a little bit more sharper. So we're hopefully not just speaking, in a trivial metaphorical way, right? Because that's like a risk of transplanting some of these concepts. And so it's good when there's corrections or precisions made so that triviality can hopefully be reduced.
To be honest, it's not even triviality. I really think the way that you're approaching it is spot on. It's just I just wanted to just point out that it's very important. It's very important where it comes from, and it's just insane. Like for 2,000 years, you had a space in which the one was assumed on, and that means that if we want to think about space newly, we have to even take that into consideration, which I think is these are more abstract mathematics. It starts to deal with that, but. The way that, for example, Bernard Riemann writes about it is not very mathematical, actually. It's quite accessible essay. Like I think people would benefit to read. I'm gonna put the essay on the side.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I would be grateful for that. Thank you. Yeah, so basically or does anyone else have anything that they want to add or comment or refine or contest? No? Okay. I'll just say, like, if there's anything, you just like turn on your mic and go for it, because it's hard for me. I don't see everyone in the class, so if someone puts a hand up or whatever, I don't see it. So you're just gonna have to be aggressive and just go for it right on the microphone. But yeah, the kind of questions that I wanted to just kind of be transparent about that are kind of going through my mind while reading Winter are how to make this kind of this, if we're talking about these new genres of being human, again we'll speak about what that means in Winter, these inexistent genres of humanness, if you will. How do we make them intelligible, navigable, and practicable? And again, this concept of the inexistent is helpful, I think, with regards to this question of planetary dimensionality, because arguably this condition ontologically exists, right? When we talk about the increased interconnection, interdependence, complexification of our techno-social reality, this is a kind of, this ontologically exists, but let's say logically inexist in relation to like developing ramified modes of coexistence within such a paradigm, right? Again, I've kind of repeating this kind of insistence on making ready, which I think is a potential role for art as a vehicle to make ready for these types of embedding these different modes of navigation. Yeah, and then the big question too is like, how do we envision constructing these concept spaces in order to exit this governing concept space of man, right? Because that is, of course, again, with Winter, we'll see that these figures of man one, man two, basically function as even like, I would even say prior to the episteme for her, but nonetheless primary frames of reference around which social orders are come into being, are operationalized, and justified in air quotes. Yeah, so I think with those questions in mind, it's good to yeah, jump right into Winter, who is basically making she's kind of making that case, right? This kind of counter cosmogonic counter cosmogonic, it's difficult to say, case via epistemology, right? So she's really kind of taking it from that angle. This is this is a quote from Linda Alcoff, you know, who's just basically endorsing Winter. So, but of course, recognizing uh, the Janus-faced histories, if you want, of European Enlightenment scientific thought, right? And that's a huge theme in Winter. Is this, you know, how do we adjudicate this the Janus-faced reality of both the achievements that were enabled from these moments, but also that, you know, unleashed sort of unprecedented violence, both on humans, environments, etc., as well. So it's a quite like realist, I would say, position in that sense. So basically, the text that we're looking, just to give it a bit of context, even though Winter, you know, announces it herself, I think it's interesting to just be explicit about it. So we read the text that was proposed was a ceremony found. You know, the easy title of the ceremony found towards the autopoietic turn, overturn, its autonomy of human agency and extraterritoriality of self-cognition. So this is basically an update of an essay that she had written in '84 that was more succinctly titled "The Ceremony Must Be Found After Humanism." And as far as I know, this 2015 text could be it's definitely got to be one of her last published texts, because like, as I mentioned, she's quite old at the moment. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to see her kind of try to answer to some of their own problems that she raised, you know, much earlier. So basically, in this essay, she's based in the essay that we read, the updated version. She's basically trying to, you know, she maps out her program, and then she basically is advocating for what she calls like a new studia, based on a kind of combination of Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, in order to generate the type of epistemologies or the epistemic revolution she thinks is required to achieve this autopoietic overturn. Right. So, and again, just please, you know, stop me anytime I realize, you know, Winter's very dense. She uses a lot of really, I would say, awkward configurations of phrasings. So, and I know that because I've been reading her for such a long time that I've just kind of internalized them, but I realize how alienating they were when I first was working with her. So don't be shy to chime in. You'll see here, like, you know, I'm just putting these quotes up so we can understand the scopes of her project. So I think what is helpful for me about, you know, mapping Winter into this kind of planetary framework, not only that, you know, in an interview already like more than 20 years ago with David Scott, he's already putting that lens on, right? That she's kind of searching for, her project is nothing less than this planetary humanism that he calls it. And of course, you know, CLR James, you know, saying that she's like the most brilliant thinker the Caribbean has known. So these are some pretty good endorsements. But I think what I appreciate about her is how she kind of helps us confront this sometimes overgeneralizing or even, let's say, ahistorical accounts of our planetary present. That's like if we only focus on that statistical general level, right? Um, you know, and she focuses on these kind of epistemic aporias, she calls them, that have basically served to lubricate the overinflation of European man, and his kind of self-anointed monopoly on processes of reasoning. As this overinflation of European man is a kind of stand-in for humanity as such. So if there's like Latourians there, if we've never been modern, you could say we've never had humanity. I think is a pretty fair analog. And again, like her work does not deny, it even relies on, to be honest, some of the so-called achievements that were ushered in this kind of Enlightenment humanism, but it highlights the underside of this movement as inseparably co-constituting. So I think it's not just, I think there's some I think two easy way outs by thinkers today that are of course aware of the histories unleashed in through in the period of enlightened thought, but they're just like, oh, it was at odds with itself, it was just, oh, Kant and Hegel being of their time, blah blah blah, like we can just move on. And I think she's going to push it further, and she's going to call it a structure, an epistemic aporia, a foundational aporia, that is not just a contradiction, but it's like it's a structural component. It's structuring the space. So yeah, basically the query that I want to kind of keep in mind is this, in this again pretty brief glimpse into the systemic model proposed by Winter, and it's widely, it's a kind of philosophical and historical account, is basically like, if man and one too are the figurative agents driving along your modernity into concrete existence, how are they operationalized? Through what aesthetemes are their distinct self-conceptions externalized in spatial terms and made reproducible through technologies? So of course you're hearing me repeat a lot of this stuff. We're introducing here a new term called aestheme, which was located in the essay that we hopefully read. This is a very interesting term. Winter was unable to locate the referent. It's a very obscure referent, just to some kind of McNeill archaeologist figure, if I'm not, or an anthropologist. But also, obviously, if we have the concept of the aestheme or episteme, sorry, we can kind of understand what aesthemes mean. So this would be the representational regime that is subtending or is sort of bracketed by these broad historical sort of brushstrokes. And so basically Winter's projects takes, her starting point is essentially the origin of the universe. I mean, she's really giving us a thorough account to the development of its life forms, with an emphasis on the so-called third event that marks the evolution of the human as a sort of symbol-wielding creature. And because we are a symbol-wielding creature, we have the capacity to create fictions and artificial worlds. So basically, the ramifications of this evolutionary accident are what underwrite Winter's broad problem space of work. That basically, as a species, we're hybrid biological and metabiological creatures. And it's this condition that enables us to become auto-instituting. We auto-institute human social organizations. And this is both empowering and entrapping, right? And she uses the term homo narrans, like narrative homo narrans, to emphasize how these descriptive statements, like who we are, these are the descriptive statements that serve as the kind of sociogenic replicator code, right? Who we are, these descriptive statements, they're the instituting force behind these autopoietic forms of organization. And again, for just to kind of give a little bit of context that I think is important and highlights Winter's extremely interdisciplinary account. She's borrowing this again from the I guess quite highly novel scientific discoveries at the time, this kind of idea of autopoietic system, of course, comes from like Varela Maturana from biology. So again, this is nothing new today for us, but at the time of her coming to these ideas and these systems, she's borrowing cues from a wide variety of, let's say, the most sort of cutting edge discoveries at the time. So yeah, so basically these who we are descriptive statements, the sociogenic replicator code, it institutes these it like kicks off or serves as a frame of reference for those autopoietic structures. That means self-reproducing, such that socio-normative ways of being and relating, epistemic ways of knowing, and you know, as well as our axiological commitments, right? The kind of values that we're upholding in performance, not just rhetorically, they synchronize with that descriptive statement. And because of that synchronization, they create a sort of law-like frame of reference for behaviors, hierarchies, you know, taxonomies, and practices. So this is quite these descriptive statements are almost like a kind of gravitational force for these human social systems. And they basically, these descriptive you know, statements, they serve as, you know, cosmogonical narrations in causal ways. So they stand in for laws of nature, or we could just more simply say naturalization. And they basically orient us and operationalize the coordination of behaviors and values required to preserve the particular human social system in question. So if we just put it simply, being human implies this socio-fictive partial realization of conditions of our own embedding, right? So we're creating the spaces or conditions of our own embedding, our technologies and environments that auto-catalyze adaptive behaviors, right? What we are told with this descriptive statements, the sociogenic replicator code, is that we're compelled to adapt ourselves to the ideals contained within that conceptual figuration. So these adaptive behavioral interactions in and to the world, they don't only bear externalities, like they don't just manifest in our tools and all that other stuff that we make because we are having this frame of reference of this idealized human, but they also, because we produce externalities that create, you know, things and stuff in a world that we interact with, we're creating a feedback dynamic that actually like imprints the neurochemical level of our brain, such that you know, and this is something more in the cognitive sciences known as like the artifactual mind thesis, right? In the sense that there'll be like modern brains and medieval brains and this and that basically all these sort of interactions with the stuffs that are produced leave signatures at a neurological level that can be seen. So this generic human system model is what basically allows Winter, you know, so she's describing that very general level of human social organization. So to be clear, when she's describing it on that general level, you know, this would have been for her, she would say this is basically how human societies work at a universal level. They're going to have different figures of who that idealized genre of being human is as their referent, right? But nonetheless, as a kind of system, that is for her a kind of universal thing. And they're regionally specific, like I said, which is why we have diverse human, you know, social orders that historically exist. But so that with that general system in mind, this is what allows Winter to explain how specific, you know, who we are, descriptive statements have now driven like concretely this expansive bracket of history identifiable as long Euromodernity. Again, that Euromodernity term is borrowed from Lewis Gordon, meant to evoke the fact that modernity is not exclusively European. And for her, it commences with the invasion of the Americas in 1492, and it continues through to the present day. So basically what's also important about Winter here, right, because she's got this general model, but then maps specific instances of it, she's really calling upon us to consider history in a very multiscalar way, or at least binocular, right? To kind of keep in mind this like species level description of our evolutionary history through to the specific regional instances that occur. So she's kind of asking us again. She's one of these general and particular, let's say, kind of thinkers. For for anyone that has a lot of or any sort of knowledge about the species being concept for Marx, maybe that's something that we can keep in mind to address. I'm not well versed on that topic. I know it exists, and I've been asking myself, well, what is the difference between say Winter's account and that one? So if anyone has any insights, like keep that in mind. So basically, for in Winter's model, this long Euromodernity, it passes through two descriptive statement phases, if you want. And this would be Man 1 and Man 2. And each of them, but what's important to recognize about each of them is that they are always an overinflation of man with humanity. So basically, what's at work in these descriptive statements and their inflationary, the fact of their inflation is basically a conflation of the normative with the natural, right? So the normative fictitious description we have suddenly becomes apprehended universally as natural, as just the way it is. Right, so basically, these Western European cultures arrive at inventing, and this is like how Western European cultures, through the inflation of this figure of Man 1 and Man 2, this is basically how Western European cultures come to legitimize or adjudicate otherness. Even if they're differently grounded between the Man 1 and the Man 2. So to put it really briefly, Man 1 correlates with this is like the beginning of the Renaissance. So Man 1 correlates with the physical sciences and marine navigation. So figures like Copernicus, Columbus are primary exemplaries of this. And in this way, we can understand otherness in this phase is tied to geography, right? The development of the so-called New World. And in Man 2, it coincides more with bioevolutionary sciences like Darwin and Malthus, where phenotypical, religious, cultural difference, and competitive economic fitness, this is what constitutes that like human-animal split, reasoning or non-reasoning divide, which is how otherness is constituted. And more just common everyday speech, Man 2 is more akin to Homo economicus, essentially, and the sort of cosmology linked with liberalism come neoliberalism. So this kind of, what's important to mention here is that, Man 1, although like Man 1 does have a religious underpinnings, Man 2 certainly moves abruptly away from that. And that, Western European ambition to secularize the human through these ontogenic or phylogenic categories alone, as if that alone could stand in as our descriptive statement, it produced basically an accompanying re-mythologization in the form of this over-representation. However, it did so under the, very deceptive premise that this concept was, purified of myth, so to speak. So it's this sort of illusion of mythic uncontamination that we can start to see what Winter means by this concept of the founding epistemic aporia, right? This sort of unresolvable thing. And just adjacently, I think that there's, in less obscure language, I think that there is also an interesting, if we're talking about these like structuring points of ignorance, epistemic aporia, to highlight, a really infamous text from Charles Mills on white ignorance, where ignorance is for him to indicate, because there's innocent forms of ignorance, right? Like we just don't know. But then there's like structuring forms of ignorance, which are about like deliberate obscuring or deliberately making unknowable, if you want. So basically, this type of pernicious ignorance is a premise on a false belief. So it's via the recognition of this epistemological aporia that we can come to see how the Anthropocene nomenclature, for instance, rehearses this normative conditioning of epistemology, because it basically acts as a kind of almost like linguistic artifact, if you want, that confirms Winter's assessment that our current driving epistemes are oriented by this bio or phylocentric monohumanist over-representation, right? So, but I think this is really important. Is like, what are these foundational points, epistemological aporias, or I'd say more politically structured? What are these, structuring forces of ignorance, if you want, in the non-naive sense? So how does that make sense for everyone so far? How is everyone doing? Do you need a little break, or should I just continue? Okay, I'll just continue. So basically, the stakes of this of her assessment, right, of her big model, is what she calls for in this autopoietic overturn. And it necessitates this corresponding epistemic transformation in order to exert this trap of this cosmogonical recursion, right? Because this is what she's describing, a recursive process here. So Winter's speculative counter cosmogony lays this kind of causal referential groundwork for new historical aesthetemes, or epistemes and aesthetemes. And she's and in so doing, like, one thing I really want to highlight that I'm trying to work through is that she's kind of inadvertently, this is more my take on it, but she's inadvertently generating a concept of human freedom that is tied to ideas of non-adaptation, right? Because basically, if all of our energies are focused on adapting to this referential idealized concept man or what have you, the freedom is not in adapting to that mode, but it's in the kind of self-conscious movement of non-adaptation from such a figure. And this is what allows us to construct discontinuities from historical, let's say, historical brackets, if you want. I think someone's mic is on. So unless you would love to speak, maybe it'd be great to keep it off. Thanks. So yeah, so I'd like us to keep that concept of non-adaptation in mind, because it's going to come up a few times, I think, and probably in their third class, so next week, thinking about non-adaptive bootstrapping. So that's a kind of basically a very broad, quick and dirty overview of Winter's project, and hopefully that made sense. And so I thought we could now like follow a little bit more closely what she's speaking about in the text, and especially in the one that we read, where she's basically, if the 1984 text was about the need to find a ceremony, now we have the ceremony found. So she's made a proposition, at least, that we can work with. So just to be clear, what does she mean by ceremony? So it's extremely clear. The ceremony for Winter is the negation of the two forms of co-human negation indexed by Man 1 and Man 2. So basically, when she's talking about the co-human, so she's talking, when you invent Man 1 and inflate that as if humanity, you're already like chopping up what the human is. You're already like rendering those non-humans. So the ceremony is the negation of these two forms of constitutive co-human negation. So again, I would make the claim, maybe you agree, maybe not, that when we're thinking about what this ceremony is, to me, this is bound to thinking about how to invent modes of non-adaptation. And of course, in fairness, that's not a permanent state. It's not like you can't be permanently in, just as you can't be permanently in revolution or something, right? Like you can't be permanently in non-adaptation. So it is in relationship to adaptation as well, but this, let's say, first movement would be one of non-adaptation. Right, and so basically, just to give a little bit more, what I'm going to do in this part is basically give a little bit more precision to these figures, man 1 and man 2, and then do a very quick, let's say, presentation of certain technologies, imaging, etc., that was co-emergent with these figures, so that we can start bringing in the domain of techne alongside, charting this kind of historical co-emergence, if you want. So as we know, man 1 emerges in the Renaissance, beginning in 1492. This is the first map, I believe, with the word America written on it. And basically, so this is the beginning, of course, of the colonization of indigenous peoples, which which this figure of man further lubricated the Middle Passage and the enslavement of Black Africans to actually construct the so-called New World. So the first negation of co-humanity here is based on selection and disselection of the human according to the standards of a Eurocentrically conceived notion of rationality. So, and drawing the line between those rational creatures and those who are like subordinate to nature. So basically, the consequence of this is that those who are outside of these confines of man 1 are basically apolitical creatures, with the consequence that they are denied historical agency, right? And of course, this is like one of the most infamously racialized claims in Hegel's work, where he's describing the African continent. We don't even need to quote him, but plenty of text to refute it. And I think the scholar Badur Alagra has, some helpful contextualization. So basically, man 1 emerged out of the Renaissance as a Christian man, transformation that occurred in part as a response to the encounter in the New World. This Christian man would later be resignified in order to conform to the emerging secularization route, which reinscribed man as moral into a new formulation of man as rational and political. So basically, man 1 is correlated with this homo politicus, as I said. Those who were not part of the category man 1, ahistorical, apolitical creatures of nature, according to the perverse logic of othering at that time. And later on, with man 2, so we have a revision from the transition between man 1 and man 2. This is where we get into the kind of homo economicus figure, made possible by Western episteme's Darwinian division between the naturally selected Europeans, marked by a boundary that inscribed man 2 as breadwinning and man's other as laboring, right? So this is basically the justification for accumulation of wealth. So the violence of, and I think this is also a really important point of what Alagra says, the violence of man's overrepresentation is in its foreclosure of a non-hierarchical referent we, right? So this is something we maybe want to emphasize, like what would be a non-hierarchical referent we of humanity as a kind of ambition to articulate beyond mere words. And of course, like the, what's going on at the time, at least in the world of visual arts, is of course the birth of, Renaissance painting, perspective. So, and this is something that Damian Javonovich has pointed out, that the more profound than these icons of belonging to Renaissance that we're all very familiar with, Brunelleschi, Alberti, etc., was the reinvention of modern space. So basically modernity or Euromodernity arrives with the construction of a new spatial ordering schematic that's very different from medieval space. So the space that is this, even if we're operating in this like 2,000-year-old conceptually speaking, Euclidean spatial paradigm, if you want, of like familiar space, or thinking that we know space a priori outside of the domain of mathematics, is very different from the space belonging to medieval and how things were ordered. So this perspective changed that by introducing a new idea of universal space, a space that was even, measurable, and equally potent in all directions, and whose ordering conforms to the fixed point of the observer's gaze. So the sort of argument that I'm suggesting, or the thing that I'm wanting us to think together simultaneously, is my argument is that it is because of this particular invention of space that this abstract conceptual figure of man one finds a place to situate himself in an idealized site, with tools and methods of reproducible representation to embed this otherwise purely philosophical figure. So this is sort of the pitch, right? That is like guiding us, or the hypothesis, if you want. This is also the time during the Renaissance that the writer Keith Tilford reminds us is when we first see the emergence of the author as artist. So the implementation of spatial understanding, privileging this kind of singular vantage point in Renaissance perspective, it not only naturalizes this human binocular vision as, a so-called naturalistic account depicting reality, but it serves as a sort of prehistorical nourishment, I think, for the developments of political liberalism, where the individual is understood as a sort of basic building block unit of any social system. And most of liberal societies' freedoms, legislative freedoms, and so on, are located at that scale of a unit, right? When you were mentioning this kind of units of organization, that would be one key figure, this kind of individual. So of course it would be, one thing if these developments just happened, regionally speaking, and it was just a European phenomenon. But this method of spatial localization, of understanding space, understanding relationships, placing things, etc., became a tool for the operational inflation of man one, as a stand-in for humanity at large. So for those of you who had a chance to read the Massimo Scolari text, for instance, with this, it's a very short one. It's not a philosophical text, it's more of a historical one. It's even quite funny because you can tell Scolari is quite pleased that these missionaries failed in their attempt to win over the Chinese with their image mastery. So this is basically, this is happening in the 16th century. The Jesuit missionaries arrived in China, trying to win over the Chinese with this particular perspectival genre. And they went far beyond, as he noted, just trying to teach the Chinese the proper way to represent things, but was also trying to impart a particular way of thinking. So it was trying to advocate basically convergence between sight and thought itself, right? And I think what's important between these two different ways of depicting reality is, of course, in one version we have, in the European version, we have things, things changing, reality changes proportion depending on the position of the ideal observer inferred by the work. So basically in that model, reality is distorting itself to conform to human vision, whereas in other models of perspectival, methods, if you want, reality, the proportions of reality are preserved, so they don't conform to the gaze of a human. So they don't, there's not going to be a vanishing point or something. So the tenacious rejection from the Chinese of this way of spatially organizing representations of reality in reference to the measure of, man as the measure of all things, is really hilariously summarized with this quote from the that Scolari documents from Suchet as saying, he who judges painting according to the concept of resemblance shows the understanding of a child. So you can see what sort of opinions were going on at the time in this lobbying for representational dominance. I don't even know what you call it. Hegemony, if you want. So yeah, and then of course, the beginning of this period, the 1492 period, obviously coincides with, we're talking about the so-called discovery of the Americas, which is impossible. If you had a chance, I know it was additional reading, but the text from William Bollhauer is quite compelling, basically making the case that not only is the so-called New World defined by cartography, like obviously its discovery wouldn't have even been possible without it. So in his account, there's a quote, continuous semiotic play between the matter under analysis, the land, and the form of analysis, the map. And he basically calls the culture of the map America's precognition. And he's urging us to study the map, similar to Siegart's text from last week, not as a representation of space, but as a space of representation. Once again, bypassing this sort of, I think, too limiting binary of like the map versus the territory, right? So basically, Bollhauer emphasizes the power of cartographic typologies, precisely at the same moment, right? This is, again, this kind of co-emergence of this philosophical European humanism and the development of these cartographic and therefore navigational capabilities are happening at the same time. So the genre of cartography, its most important historical moment when it was called upon to invent the other hemisphere of the globe, coincided with the critical moment in which the conventions of the modern Ptolemaic map were jostling with those of the old medieval map to represent American space. Cartographic form, in other words, was undergoing a paradigmatic shift, and its laboratory for experimenting with new structuring techniques was, of course, the New World. So, Bollhauer kind of goes on to call this America is a semiotic drama, semiotic drama of the map. And so basically this kind of third level of existence, if you want, this kind of semiotic power, not just the fact of the map, but its semiotic power really ties in well to this force, in again, in its Janus-based reality, that Winter kind of asserts with this naming of us as a homo narrans, like narrative creatures who are, it's not just descriptive, it's an operational thing. So I'll just close with the Bollhauer quote here. So what is also needed is a global map of the map's sign activity so that one can go beyond single and necessarily partial cartographic performances. This will require us to understand how each of the elementary systems of image, word, and line produce semiotic information. That is, how the map's object, the world, is transformed into these three different ways of encoding space. So this is also going to be we're kind of building up a bit of a vocabulary attached to other disciplines with this idea of encoding, right? This is also related to the sociogenic replicator code, as we mentioned. And we're slowly moving into this idea that Anil Bawakavia has been writing about in computational space in terms of embedding and encoding. But right. So this was just basically a very quick way. I mean, there's a lot more work to be done here, but just to kind of make the brief case about thinking about Winter's figurations of Man 1 and Man 2 through this kind of lens of techne, if you want, in order to understand how they became operational. because these figures just don't arrive. They're not just like ideas in someone's head and then they manifest Euromodernity. I mean, that's like a bit ridiculous. So they need to find ways to perform themselves at scale. So basically, yeah, so this is how the kind of foundational reinvention of space for embedding these encoded figures of man is inseparable from the operationalization of this auto institution that Winter talks about. So the point, of course, is not just to kind of show how we got here, right, to give us this historical account, although it is important for understanding path dependencies, right, like things that are irreversible potentially now. But is to kind of use this as an example for, on the need to construct other sites and conditions of embedding from which to escape this kind of punitively interpolating, who we are descriptive statements that are like proving lethal to human inhabitability on Earth. So the spatial aestheme that undergirds this Euromodern procedures of localization, it exists both in this the creation of an author, as we said, right? And that is particular register as in the author of an artwork, but more importantly, it gains, this spatialization also gains mimetic traction because the method of spatialization is anonymous, right? Like anyone could copy that mode of seeing and reproduce a naturalistic vision, a naturalistic picture based on a method. And I think this is quite important to think about today in art in terms of like, what is our relationship to something like templating and mimesis and developing methods that are anonymous, that allow for more attractability rather than, the more, let's say, conservative picture of art is like making something original, singular, etc., and all of the commodity fetishism that goes on with that. So how are we doing? Does anyone want to stop and have a chat about any of this? Or do you need a break? What should I just kind of trying to think? There's not too much more to go. It's more, I just thought we could, I'd take a little pause here in case anyone wanted to intervene, because I do want to at least touch upon some of the last bits of Winter's text, so that we can at least, bring on the table or bring into the class what she is proposing as a kind of, in her words, this new, epistemic revolution. What type of new study would be amenable to this task, if you want. So before we do that, is there anyone? Yeah, do you want to, Emilio?
Yeah, sure. I don't want to be the math person, but just because
That's
cartography. No, I just wanted to mention briefly that again, like what you said about cartography is like really important also for what's happening in mathematics at period, because a lot of like this infinitesimal calculus, so ideas of limits, ideas of continuity, it's happening because of cartography. So because there were like explorations in colonialism that needed more precision for navigation across maps, new techniques in mathematics, triangulation that places you in the world is necessary for this to work. So even things like continuity and discontinuity at the level of like infinitesimal is in that period similarly developed with this in mind. And I think that ties nicely with the idea of construction and mapping.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that. And Matheus?
Oh yeah. Hi. I was just thinking, if we are going to visit the end of Winter's text, I think we will go through that. But I was thinking that when I was reading her text, I was always reading autopoietic, as in Matriana and Varela's work, and then I suddenly realized that she never uses the word in this text autopoietic. She's always using it autopoetic. And I think it's this, probably chose it on purpose, I think, because of her relation to Césaire's work that she quotes on the end, and all the poetry and the poetic role that she's trying to summon for this new studio, something like that. And I was thinking, if you have had any thoughts about that, about why to choose autopoetic and not autopoietic.
Good catch. That's some detailed reading. I think I would conclude I don't. It is not like a well thought out position, but I would concur with your assessment because she's essentially taking the Césaire line pretty like word for word. You know what I mean? So I agree. It's probably like, and she's, as you see, she's. I don't think it's a mistake because she's obviously very precise with her language, even if it's convoluted. Um, so yeah, I think you're probably quite correct. I'm not sure I would go that far. Like again, I have some doubts position wise about this new studio, but nonetheless, I think it's worth to carry through. And I think some of the general ambitions are really exciting that are being proposed. But yeah, good catch on that one. Eduarda, you wanted to jump in?
I want to comment something that Matteo said. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm on a bus right now. I think that this might be related to something that Glissant proposes, which is the question of poetics. Exactly, like this is like a central theme on his work, and if I'm remembering correctly, he has like 5 books, and he goes building this notion of what is poetic, and for him it's very important because it is sort of what comes out from relation. It is what the encounter of 2 persons or of 2 cultures or of 2 languages or of 2 different system networks, and when they encounter together, you have like a poetic action, you have puralization, but you have then this sort of poetic moment. I wouldn't call it an event as well, but it causes a friction in the real or something of the sort. But I wanted to ask you if you could comment a little bit on like Dutch art, Dutch and Flemish art, because you were going to the question of perspective and of techne and episteme. And I was wondering, what do you make out of them? Because they have sort of like a strong and quick development of markets and overseas markets. So they begin to have like genre painting and all sorts of painting very early, when most of other countries were like only exploring religious or mythological subjects. You have like still life, which is a very modern genre of painting, and they were exploring like these things of domesticity and the life of the bourgeois. And you know there are many studies about the class relation and what was done with Dutch art. I'm particularly fascinated by it and how it tries to mimic so well, because it has like this photographic quality, and you have the camera obscura. So I was wondering, what do you make out of this phenomenon? Because I think it's so unique when compared to the rest of the European art that it fascinates me.
Yeah, that's a great point, and thanks for your earlier comment as well. I don't feel like I don't have enough knowledge to properly answer your question. It's something that I'd have to look into. I don't have I have a pretty poor art historical background, so my knowledge would be superficial at best to apply to that. It's an interesting question though, for sure. I mean, I wish I could better get to it, but I don't feel like I'm equipped to do so with any justice. Sorry about that. Are there things that you want to share about that with us though, that you think would be helpful?
I was reminded so of it's something else, but I think it relates to this. Are you familiar with Severo Sarduy, the Cuban poet?
No.
Sarduy was part of Tel Quel along with Cristeva, Barabs, etc. And I relate him sort of with Otávio Paz and Glissant because they are all poets and essayists and from Latin America. So there is this cultural connection, even though they are very different from each other. And Sardui, he's very Lacanian, but at the same time sort of Foucauldian in a way, because he gives a great emphasis to episteme. He deals on this in Ensaios Generales del Barroco. It is what he deals mostly with, and he talks about it like sort of as if you made these sketches or models, or I'm forgetting the word in English, but like maquettes, like the word is full of intellectual maquettes. And then he goes through a very detailed way of looking at Galileo and then Newton and then Einstein. And he's always relating technological development and scientific research with artistic production. So for him, like the episteme is like this whole bunch of superpositions of things and how they create this singular picture for a certain time. And how he deals with that, I wouldn't say that his whole project is okay, but there are many interesting aspects to it. It's a very particular type of Lacanian structuralist reading, and very applied to Cuban poetry. It was mostly written thinking of what he calls neo-Barroco, neo-Baroque, thinking of the poetry that they were writing at their time, that he was writing as well. So I think there are many similarities to Lissan also being a poet and giving this strong emphasis on literature as a way to understand this sort of phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you don't mind, could you write the name in the chat just so that we can share the reference for, selfishly for me, but also for anyone else that wants to maybe look up, would be fantastic. All right. So, yeah, so I think, we can just kind of wrap up now with a little bit of that, touching upon, let's say, the second part of the, we'll do this a little bit more briefly so we can have a time for discussion, but the second part of that winter essay, I think, is worth talking about. Again, because, I do want to get into thinking through this question of like how to, the question of how to exit those governing epistemes of man through an idea of non-adaptive bootstrapping, and this is mainly to try to you could say, in a way, trying to think about like accountable forms of speculation, if you want, because at least in my field, in arts and design, there's a kind of I call it like possibility idealism. Like you just say possibility, and you don't define anything, or speculation, and then there's like zero accountability to reality. And I think that there's a lot to be. So I will be using that as a way to start moving from possibility to realizability. Again, that's for next week, but that's what's going to be entailed with this non-adaptive bootstrapping coming up. So it's a little teaser. But it's the way that I'm trying to imagine, I guess in a way trying to, I personally, I wouldn't use the term ceremony for this exit, but okay. So if I prefer this non-adaptive bootstrapping as opposed to ceremony, but they're basically synonymous, and that's what I would mean by it in winter sense, the ceremony. So given that, such cosmogonically charted webs of significance are at the same time, the indispensable condition of our being able to performatively enact ourselves as being human in these genre-specific terms of an I and a we. This is a quote from the text, right? This is going, just to be clear where this is coming from. How can we then come to know our social reality outside the terms of the oi-socializing mode of auto-institution, in whose web-spinning field alone we are recursively enabled performatively to enact ourselves in the genre-specific terms of our fictive modes of kind? So if that's not a mouthful, I don't know what is. It's like the simple way of putting it is like, how can we justify thinking outside the given terms of self-reference that now orient our reality? We can just keep it, summarize it in that way. So if we're going to answer, this is kind of Winter's answer to this philosophical problem of thinking, outside, or she says in her text below, right, with her evocation of Rastafarianism, thinking outside these given referential indexes. So this is where Winter kind of merges Fanonian sociogeny with Aimé César's Science of the Word program. And she, again, to insist, she supplanted Freud from the lineage of paradigm shifters. When we talk about paradigm shifts, we talk about like Copernicus, Darwin, and then Freud threw himself in there, which is kind of dubious. But she like removes him, puts in Fanon, and says now we have to complete the epistemic revolution. Again, the important part of the sociogenic plea is to reintroduce or reappraise this, I would say, existential dimension of being human, and to put that on par with also just like scientific inquiry. So this very much is qualitative sort of dimension, not only what it is to be human, but what it is to be like human, if you put it like that. And she's using this to like I said, to compare and contrast humanists in the mode of the genomic principle that defines the species identity of us, alongside the quality, like what it is like to be an individual of this species. So her epistemic integration of this third level of existence is in many ways a response to the need to overcome this CP Snow two divide sort of thing, the divide of the humanities and the hard geophysical biosciences on the other. And she does this by backing Aimé César's Science of the Word / Nature. So again, for César, he recognizes the achievements certain sciences have had, but chastises them or criticizes them for saying they remain impoverished with regards to addressing the qualitative dimensions of human life. But I think it's also interesting to see here that he's kind of trying to yoke together this general species concern together with the individual or the particular, right? Because that's I think a lot of the thinkers that we're calling upon have that general tendency in their various disciplines, and they're trying to work out what that is. So again, and he's notably a peer, of course, of Glissant. When I say peer, I don't necessarily mean that they're friends, but in the same historical space as like Glissant, Grothendieck, and so on, who we looked at last week, thinking through this particular universal relation. So Winter's proposition of a new studia is a kind of to nourish this autopoietic overturn is bound to her demand for the creation of what she calls the counter cosmogony. So again, in my parlance, I want to up the ante and say, like, how about counter cosmology? Right. So the counter cosmological demand positions human, to reiterate, in this movement of non-adaptation, because it implies a conscious agency needed to construct discontinuities. So the problem of coming to know our social reality outside the terms of this socializing mode of auto-institution is a question of how to actuate non-adaptive frames of reference that can enable what Winter calls, and this is a quote from her, an outer view, from which perspective the grammars of regularities of boundary and structure maintaining discourses are perceivable. So these outer views establish new referential terms, positions, and sites, very important, through which to invent ceremonies of exit from this punitive cosmological trap that we're in. And, and this is quite important, right? Because weren't we just we keep talking about the site and situatedness, and we talked all about Haraway last week, and now we're going on about outer views, right? But again, this is not, an outer view isn't a view from nowhere. It is the necessity to construct a new concept space from which to generate a new vantage point of entry. So I think that's quite important. But it also gives us a lot of traction to say that we're not just bound to the givenness of whatever site is given to us. So again, it's not, this outer view isn't a rehearsal of the positivist delusion claiming a view from nowhere. Rather, it's making intelligible and perceivable these contingent, historical fictions that govern the coordination or configuration of a world. And here I'd just like to bring in, to close out on a productive and fun note, because of course the essay that I did send you of my own was about fictions. And I think this example from W.E. Du Bois called The Megascope is quite interesting, because he not only, this is less known because the works are not published, but very often between his major works, major philosophical contributions, he was writing this kind of like pulpy fiction, science fiction, and weird stuff. And in this one particular text from about 1908 to 1910, he invented, in the fiction, he invented this technology called the megascope, which allowed people who, which is essentially like an Oculus Rift, which allowed people to see what he called the great near. So you would have a telescope to see the stars far away. The great near was, this device would allow you to see the structures of racism and classism, etc., for all the users who would wear it. Again, this is a fiction. So not only do we have this example of a fiction in a story, a fictional technology in a story that offers this different vantage point, and in the story of Du Bois, it's a black it's the scientist who invents this technology is a black sociologist, a white sociologist a couple comes in fascinated. First they think he's a slave, then they realize he's an actual sociologist, but for them they don't see these kinds of structures in the world. So this sociologist had built this device to allow folks who don't experience this to see this plain as day. But I think even more importantly is in the work of Du Bois himself, is that knowing, and this was sort of theorized by Whitney Battle-Baptiste, a brilliant archaeologist, that this kind of engagement with fictional writing for Du Bois between these major oeuvres was what allowed him to kind of explore and served as a kind of catalyst for the creation of these things. So not only was fiction an outlet, but it was like what enabled the significant sociological positions of him to emerge, which is a bit less known. So basically, to get back to this new studia that is, according to Winter, needed, this is what is going to be required of yoking together this kind of general, particular, existential, statistical, if you want, view, which is, that's what will enable this kind of epistemic revolution required to generate such outer views, if you want. It refutes a kind of approach to the planetary from the dimension of this sheer immensity or generalizing status, but it activates procedures of localization that bind this new geo-epoch to transform practices of inhabitation, which would of course take place in our literary works and so on and so forth. So I'll just close by saying, like, I wouldn't position this new studia as a rejection of the real. Certainly Winter is one of the maybe few humanities scholars at that time doing deep dives into archaeology, biology, chemistry, and so on, alongside material that is like proper to the domain of being a humanities scholar, but it's really trying to advocate for some sort of integrative approach of bringing these two worlds together, which I find quite helpful, even if it's a very loose sketch in how we're going to be thinking about the interfacing between models and everyday life practices that are going to be transforming as a result. So then just kind of finish up on that, and yeah, and then we can, if you still have energy, I know today was a lot, but we can have a nice discussion if you're still up for it.
Yeah, so maybe just a quick comment. Like one comment and one question, I guess. The comment is that this text of Winter, which was fascinating, by the way, very much struck me as extremely Lacanian without mentioning Lacan at all, in the sense that the way of understanding our embeddedness in systems of significance that she presents is pretty much the same as Lacan presents our relation to the real, as a relation only of a signifier to another signifier to another signifier and never to the real itself, right? Actually, the leader of my research group is working on a very similar project, like through Lacan, because he's a Lacanian psychoanalyst and approaches like economy with this kind of thinking. So this was really interesting for me to read, since I haven't encountered Winter before. But at the same time, there's this kind of gripe I have with this text, and I guess with many of the texts that kind of try to, as you put it, move from the possible to the realizable as well. And I mean, maybe it's just not that so much I have a gripe as it's like a real issue, I guess, with creating these modes of representation that try to enact something different. And this was a text that was coincidentally asked about the Xenofeminist Manifesto when we read that at seminar next to Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit, is that we have like we're creating some sort of a new mode of representation with this text, and this often goes for manifestos. But this text is very dense in language, in modes of signification that are known for us as academics, maybe for certain like genres of artists, etc. But how do we approach the problem that this kind of language that tries to create something new, it won't really be very much readable for, say, let's just use this example, like for a normal worker, so to speak, in the sense of a blue-collar worker. There was a good answer given by Ewa Majewska, a Polish feminist,
She's a good friend. She's a good friend.
I was her student for years.
What did she say? Let's go with her.
That every kind of new mode of representation that tries to bring a different world of being into the world has to force a new language into the world, in the sense that we cannot stop and think about this. But what if it's not widely understandable, but it's something that just has to be done. And it's the same thing that was done with Communist Manifesto and Capital, which was read by workers inside the factories and just translated by themselves for themselves. And it's just a problem that we cannot spend time on, but I'm always kind of unsure, and I would like to hear your answer on this, especially after reading Winter, because like you mentioned, it's even for a philosopher, this is an extremely dense text to get through, right? Yeah. That has a lot of neologisms, a lot of terminology that is very much original to herself, and this is a problem, I guess, for the text of many philosophers, in the last 40 years. So this probably mostly.
Before even.
Everything after modernism, it's very much full of neologisms, dense, etc. I think this text is kind of similar to Deleuze and others in this sense. So if we think about going to the realizable, how do we think about this language? If you want to.
I mean, I think there's I mean, maybe there's like a two-part answer in the sense that 100% agree. It's not like you're going to give this text to like start flyering your neighborhood with this text and like try to build a crowd or something. That's not going to work. I mean, I think that there's also space for uh, for like disciplinary sharing of knowledge and like pushing concepts forward. And I think that there is a fair argument to say that like, yeah, with when we invent new concepts, we need new words. Like there is, and I mean, when Eva says forcing, I'm reading that as a kind of Bajousian person. I'm just like, yeah, it's all that's the ramification. That's the space of ramification. It is that activity of forcing. Um, However, it's more about, you know, and I think that's, you know, in a community together where we maybe share the same jargon, we share similar concept spaces or reference, we can be a little bit, you know, what's the, I don't want to use the word pretentious because it's like not, but you know what I mean? Just like we can be a little bit like nerdy and kind of elitist if you want, because we share this kind of common language or we can quickly explain to each other. Um, but one shouldn't think that that unto itself is like the political work necessarily. You know what I mean? I think there was even a tweet talking about the inner conservatisms of academia recently, and I don't disagree. It's like it doesn't matter if you're like morally positionally on the left. It's like you're by just kind of rehearsing the things in the same types of spaces, using the same language, the same conventions. That's conservative, right? And I think that, but I think in defense of that, that can be generative. It can help us to move things along. The point is like what do we have to do? And it's also, I think, a bit of an unfair burden to expect that one person is able to do all of these myriad tasks. But I do think it is important that there are steps made if certain ideas are useful. Not everything's that useful. If certain ideas are useful, that there are, you try to find ways of interfacing with people. I mean, I say it all the time. I think there's like, you know, this kind of performative political academic performing radicals. I'm just like, well, but just be a bit honest, you know? Do you literally go and organize? Do you do these things? Do you do all the behind the scenes things, or you just get a round of applause at a conference? It's very different work. And I think it's like you have to be humble and recognize the hard labor it is of getting groups into conversations, all those sorts of things. And I think that's a very different labor. You know, the other part of that question is to think about the Knights of Labor argument from Rancière, right? Where it's like, why does, like, who are you as a philosopher that you must speak for the worker? They can fucking speak for themselves. And the archives, that the archival work of that project that he did was to show the rich intellectual and artistic culture of the working class, right? So no one needs to be this like fancy, pretentiously speaking mouthpiece when it comes to like the actual job of political organizing. I think it's important to like be honest about where your capacities lie, where you're terrible, and where you need to listen and just be involved. And not everyone is Eva Majewska, who's incredible at both, but I think she's rather exceptional in that regard. I'm certainly not that person. But then again, that's where you work with people and you don't try to put that impossible pressure on yourself that you have to be everything at once, you know? And I mean, yeah, so that's where that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we kind of like, we could say that we need translators for this language, like into the common consciousness, so to speak. And I think like this concept of the aesthemes of artists working to create something out of those new concepts that is aesthetic, kind of like works like that as a labor of translation that can go beyond the confines of academic linguistics or whatever.
Yeah, I think today also the space that I'm really interested in, I don't do it, it's not like my thing, but I'm appreciative of what it can do, is gaming space. I think this is really, really fascinating stuff. The stuff that I'm always trying to encourage my students who have a predilection that way. I'm like, go. I think it's a really interesting vehicle to talk about this kind of yeah, and in a similar way to like how when we're talking about these outer view, like when you think about like somebody like Reza Negarestani's and his work on artificial general intelligence, right? Artificial general intelligence for him is precisely the outer view that we can that allows us to have reopen and explode the category of what is intelligence, which is not a human-centric or a machine-centric question anymore. It's about animal intelligence, like it just explodes the category of what we assumed intelligence to be because we assumed that it was us that had a monopoly on it, etc. So it's sometimes interesting to think about how these new inventions or techne related possibilities, how they help through our interaction with them, how they crack open new concept spaces. Stuff that we thought was settled and done suddenly generates an outer view from through which to question ourselves again and question other things, question certain other assumptions, which I think is the most interesting side of that debate on AI or philosophy in AI. It's like, well, what are we learning about intelligence as such that we thought was like done? it's woo, Pandora's box, open up again. Yeah.
I guess it's kind of similar along those lines. I have a question of like, this is more like a meta theoretical, I think, or meta methodological question. So, because obviously the references we're getting are not like, you know, this is trying to offer an alternative narrative to the Western man one, man two. But on some level, couldn't we also like, or are we like, what are the dangers of like, you know, when we do speak of the planetary, when we do speak about constructing a metric, like, isn't it very easy to be like a similar kind of project, but like with a different, like, you know, level of abstraction, which feels like, do you know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Well,
I don't know. Sorry.
I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting that you took it in a direction, and that's maybe my own fault of like the way I'm articulating, which I should be wary of, is that you took it in a direction that was like a singular metric. Why would we need a singular metric? Who said that? I mean, in the last talk, we were talking about constructing diversity. So to me, this means precisely going away that singular metric, or at least being context sensitive as to where metrics are applied. That we can't just like have a universal thing for everything, but we may be able to have this particular thing operate at a certain scale and another at a different scale, and then talk about the morphisms between those two, which is where I find some of the at least structural vocabulary coming from certain tendencies in mathematics, again, ones that I have extremely high bar of entry to access but seem fruitful. That seems like the kind of that's more how I would put it, rather than saying like, because I think the corollary to what you're saying is like we need to have a one world governance or something like that.
No,
like,
actually it's the exact opposite. No. What I was trying to say is actually the planetary as like idea of like a thing such as planetary scale. I'm just wondering whether that is already not already in calling upon a scale that works and operates at the level of the planetary, which like I can see how this could be, you know, maybe shifted from a different, I mean, the map making that was, you know, in the 1600s, how we're not doing the same kind of ground, but it's just very much more abstracted. We start thinking about planetary scale. Yeah, that's basically what. But I'm obviously against like, you know, totalizing forms. I'm just wondering like this idea of the planetary scale, which I think is like the new thing we're gonna be working with in the next few years. Planetary scale, ecological, something. Yeah, whether.
No, yeah. I mean, you're totally right. It's a huge risk. This is precisely, I know it's just trivial because it's a semantic choice at this point. This is why I haven't been using planetary scale. I use planetary dimensions or dimensionality, because I think it already talks about nesting that way. It already opens a space of nesting, because if I go into a room of of 20-year-olds and talk about planetary scale, they just go to like, universe.
Yeah.
That's it, right? Top down, fully top down view. And the people using that term always say, no, it doesn't mean that. But it was a bit like how accelerationism was tried to be appropriate on the left, and it was like, it doesn't mean does, it doesn't mean that. People think they have a meaning with it, and it's repeating itself. That term doesn't work, right? Like, so I think we have to be careful about, or we can be deliberate in the language we choose. Again, picking the right term isn't like, it's not like, oh, I'm getting out of that question. Not at all. It's still a danger. However, there are like ways we can describe it, at least, that hopefully are lending itself to understanding at different scales, like the scale of a fruit fly and the scale of a comet or something. And what is the relationship between those, and what types of relations do we need to understand, and which ones are kind of a bit, when we get into that question of reducing that high dimensionality, the necessity of the reduction that we talked about last week, that is also a really tricky question of like, who decides on the reduction? Like, what is that interface is a huge problem, I think. Is like understanding, what things can we reduce and what things must be present. So I think that would be, I still totally recognize the not fear, but worry that you have, because it doesn't go away by switching terms. But my hope is that by elaborating more through them and trying to give more precision to the problems and risks ahead, that we can hopefully start chipping away at that worrisome image that it's only going to be this kind of total, all-encompassing thing. I wonder if DB wants to, like, you have some interesting comments. Do you want to, are you able to speak? Do you feel comfortable to speak? Or if you want to put a note in the chat, I can also read out the questions for everyone, or comments. Or we can just
yeah, I suppose I could speak. This is Dustin. Sorry, my video is not working today.
Okay. Hey, Dustin, how's it going?
Yeah, it's good. Thank you for, it's really inspiring today. So I suppose that I would just maybe want to point to the second note I wrote, considering I think, game worlds are what we conceptualize as games or game worlds, even though that's a huge broad category. And so then of course we can do a long dragged out discussion. But again, this is where I kind of see the important entanglements between game worlds, and particularly, how we're modeling, the notion of the planet. First and foremost, as I was mentioning here in this note, there's a book by Alenda Chang, and so she writes about this concept of mesocosms. And so, mesocosms can be, for example, like our greenhouses. They can just be ponds, artificial ponds, any of these types of spaces where we cut up and demarcate what is going to be, like our object of investigation. What are going to be the ways that we intervene, and then we tinker, and then perhaps we can recalibrate and so forth. And I think one important thing is she makes a note of it too, is the mesocosm, it's porous, it's permeable. And so she gives actually an interesting example. I don't know if you know about in the Amazon, there's a group of scientists that have been doing these reforestation projects, where what they do is they take these patches of land, and I think it's up to, I don't know the exact, I have to look at the exact dimensions, but you can just think of it that they just keep cutting up these little territories and patches. So you just have, it's like a Russian doll of patches of land in the Amazon in this case. And so they've been doing this for over 30, 40 years. And, just investigating how does this also transform and shift and impact the wildlife there, and what happens when you have smaller spaces, and that doesn't allow for like habitability or biodiversity to emerge and so forth. So, and then even furthermore, I'm really curious, how game worlds, the interplanetary infrastructure aspect, I think we should really take seriously, considering that there's a lot of integration, let's say, with remote sensing and satellite technology that enters into these game worlds that are trying to more and more mimic and replicate and build digital twins. And so that's why I was bringing up this Microsoft Flight Simulator. Maybe not the most inspiring or fun simulator to play, but it's really fascinating in this respect because they are trying to, in real time, simulate our world. And so, for example, when you're playing Flight Simulator and you're in a plane, you're literally playing against a hurricane that can be happening. You're literally playing on kind of the turbulent conditions that are unfolding in our legacy world and our real world. So when this kind of brings back, I forgot the exact name of the essay last week, but I think that was kind of the map and territory relation. It's, how far is this now more, what's really the disjunction anymore there. So that was just a comment here I just wanted to throw out.
Yeah, no, I'm really grateful for your comment. I'm glad you spoke out. I mean, maybe it's also something we can, like, if you feel, I mean, I don't want to put labor on you because I'm supposed to be the one doing the work, but if there are texts or resources that you think are helpful, it could be really interesting because I think we're all going to be bringing stuff, we're bringing in our own baggage, and we have our own sets of references, and I'm definitely curious to read more on the Riemann thing, for example, or like how that relates to these kind of game and simulating conditions when we're talking about that non-adaptive bootstrapping, and also that realizability, right? This like connection between simulation and the real. So yeah, I don't know. Perhaps Zach, do you have there been other? There's got to be other classes where they wanted to kind of compile a bunch of stuff or upload. Like I could even just start a folder on Google or something, and we could just start dumping things in there and just share it among us, or it could be open for anyone. I don't think it matters, for any sort of resources that are sort of adjacent things that you think could be, relevant to the topics that we're discussing, that can help, tease it out even further. All right. Well, I think unless anyone has any pressing, or an arena channel, sure. Good. Okay. Would you mind doing that, Alina? That would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe I can set it up and send the link to Zach, because we don't see anybody's emails.
Okay, it's all very secretive. All right.
Yeah.
Well, okay, privacy is fine. No, that would be great. And I guess I know I'm fading a little bit, but does anyone have any comments or?
The only thing I was going to ask you, or just mention for maybe next time, is people are familiar with the book Micromegas. Is this weird book that Voltaire wrote? Mm-hmm. And it's like, I wrote something about this a few years ago, but basically it's like this weird Voltaire book that talks about traveling different planets. And mm-hmm. It's really fascinating because it's like, 1700s, 1800s, mm-hmm. but there's already kind of a notion of traveling across scales. So I think some people might find this interesting, just to reflect on, there's some stuff there on how, I don't know, allometric you want to call it, or like just this idea of traveling across dimensions. That's kind of interesting, and what drives the story might be interesting. Mm-hmm. Again, this is like a Voltaire book, so
that would be great. And if you feel, you said you wrote about it as well.
Yeah, but this is cringe essay, but I can share it on the arena if you want. But very cringe.
I have to share like older essays.
Yeah, this is 7 years ago, but I'll put it on the arena. It's 7 years ago, so very cringe. But yeah, cringe alert.
No, that would be great, because I know I won't have time to get through the book, but I'm really curious about how people are imagining these different methods, especially with the particular affordances of their time. Is quite
that's why it's interesting, this, because it's the first book that you have a sense of micro, mega. This character is called Micromega, and he has in his name this weird like scale problem. So he's traveling through different planets, and it's like, okay, well, how did Voltaire think about this? Why did he think about this? It's weird scientific sci-fi book. And it's interesting to see that actually. Anyway, I'm gonna put the essay on the arena. That way, we can save it one time.
Yeah, that would be really helpful, and then we can triangulate in Dustin's notion of the mesocosm.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the perfect. We'll get the nice. We'll at least get these like tripartite scale thing.
Great.
Great. Well, yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for coming back and sticking with it, and yeah, I look forward to next week. I'm just trying to remember exactly what we're doing because I don't have the paper in front of me, but it's in the schedule. So I think it's more of this abductive bootstrapping stuff or non-adaptive bootstrapping. So we'll look at some Lorenzo Magnani and think about, but we needed to have that base of Winder to understand what the problem is, I think. Great. All right. Well, wish you all a lovely evening, and see you in a week. Ciao.
Bye.
Hey, thanks, Zach.
Oh, no problem. Have a good weekend.
You too. Ciao. See you in a week.
Bye. See you in a week.